Hey class, this is Professor Grant Eisen, and I'm going to talk about the first chapter of beginning theory. I had just filled in a little bit of the introduction and sort of talked through it. So between reading it and hearing me kind of fill in some context about it, I'm hoping that that is going to help you um, with this. So let me find um, a share screen. Okay. So you should be able to see now the beginning theory, chapter one, theory before theory. So the first one is the introduction is getting us built up to this point. So this is going to be a history. So I'm gonna kind of cruise through some of the parts that I think are less interesting for us, like the history of English studies. The origin of institutional study was in Oxford and Cambridge. These were monastic, so connected to a monastery, and they were only for men, and no one who was Catholic, Jewish, Methodist, or atheist could attend these schools. So you can see how limiting the original study of English literature, languages, and things like oratory and philosophy, and I mean all of this sort of springs from this idea of English studies. And so a lot of people were locked out of um, the opportunity to study. The English as a field of study didn't happen until 1929. So even though Oxford, Cambridge, and these other institutions were offering literary studies and English type classes, it was basically for argumentation. It was reading the great classic works to figure out what kind of usage you could find in terms of crafting an argument or being persuasive or delivering speeches or things like that. Women could not receive a degree until 1920, and that was in Oxford, and in 1948 in Cambridge. So London University was a little ahead because they conferred degrees for women in 1879. But you can see how there's this history of locking people out of access to institutions. Okay, so the first Black woman in the U.S. to receive a college degree was Lucy Sessions at Oberlin College, and 1840 was the foundations of modern literature studies. So this critic and teacher, F.D. Maurice, believed that the study of literature would emancipate us from the notions and habits which are peculiar to our own age and connect us with what is fixed and enduring. So that is a kind of um, interpretation of literary studies that says that it will connect us with those things which are fixed and enduring. And so there's a universalist claim. Now, the idea of universal ideas in literature is going to come up against some argument and some confrontation, but it is a place to begin. The middle class, he believed, would feel a loyalty to the status quo. So literature kind of substituted for religion in that way. So there's a um, pretty interesting history of literary studies. And in addition to ideological control, the teaching of English also betrays a Victorian mixture about class guilt, social inequalities, and a genuine desire to improve things. We learn about things from the past. For what purpose? So we can avoid doing them in the future. We learn about um, past practices so that we can emulate what works and fix what doesn't work. Um, and so that became literature became a way to, in a fictional setting, without real lives on the line, to explore what happens in certain circumstances. What are the results of characters exercising um, decisions, and how does that work out? Okay. Um, so again, I don't want to read through all of this stuff because some of it's just gonna not be too exciting, and you can read it on your own. And if you're interested in it, hey, that's great. So um, literature is generally studied alongside language. This is, to teach translation and grammar and etymology. So literature was used to teach other things. And I think that that's still an important role of literature. The end result isn't to read the novel for the sake of knowing the novel itself. I mean, that's part of it, but it's so that you can explore, humanity, so that you can explore things that are significant about that novel and what it reflects about the world at large. Okay. So following that practice, the Harvard composition course allowed students to write their own pieces. So this was interesting as practice for vocations, which were usually law, politics, or the ministry. Those are the three big um, pushes the college graduates were going into in the early days. Very few people went to college, typically the wealthy, um, and they were going to college to learn law, politics, and religion to become a minister. After World War I, there's a surge of patriotism that ushers in a more formal study of American literature. So this is the 1920s. We are suddenly putting on the books in college classrooms American literature. Some believe that the first true American novel written was The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. This was written in the 1890s, set in 1860. It tells a story of a young boy who's orphaned, who's um, running away, and a slave on the plantation where the boy lives is also running away. And so this is Huck and Jim, and so they get on a raft and they go down the river, and Huck decides he's going to help Jim escape to free territory in the north. And so this is a book that is seen as, for the first time, not under any of the legacy of British rule. All right, so that's about 1890. So in the 1920s, then we start establishing a rationale for studying literature as literature. And again, it still has a didactic purpose, that is a teaching purpose, but then it becomes acceptable to say we're studying the work of literature to determine what this work of literature means, not only how it presents an argument in a court of law, for instance. Okay. So this caused the development of what we call close reading. So this is an offshoot of liberal humanism that we talked about in the introduction. Close reading. And I.A. Richards, who is sort of the original contemporary or modern day critic, developed a technique that we still use of practical criticism to break between language and literature, isolating text from history and context. And so students analyze, quote, the words on the page without necessarily regard to history or context, but the words on the page. And so William Empson, another critic, published 7 Types of Ambiguity, close verbal analysis of 7 types of verbal difficulty in poetry. Some don't like this way of close reading. T.S. Eliot called it the lemon squeezer school of criticism and felt that it was too formulaic and not impassioned enough and not human enough, but it was too mechanical. And so we're not going to do that. Just know that that exists, but I'm not going to list out all those things. All right. So the problems with the earlier approach is it relies on simply paraphrasing the work, and it's overwhelmingly moralistic. And the problem with interpreting a work as a moral work is whose morality gets to define what the meaning or significance or importance or ultimate judgment of a work is. So moving away from moral judgment was important in creating a more objective way of interpreting a text. Critical terms had never been defined. All right. So these 3 problems, relying on simple paraphrasing, just to sort of paraphrase what the work says, doesn't tell me what it means or what's significant about it or the way it's interpreted. So we need to move past this. There's in the 1960s, and we're going to skipping ahead. In the 1960s, we're going to reestablish connections between literature and language studies and historical considerations and philosophical questions. So the work of literature and the significance of it, it ebbs and flows. And they're not fads, but they're ways, I think, of our trying to determine what's significant and what's meaningful. And with new understanding, sometimes we're trying out new ideas and we're saying, how does this impact a work of literature in a way that we can read and interpret it and evaluate it? How can this work of literature work for us to help illuminate something about the human condition, to help illuminate something about the condition of humans who are not, um, maybe part of our cultural understanding? And so we use works of literature to broaden our horizons, to understand to a greater depth people from situations that we are not personally in, but then we get a more full picture of humanity. This helps in all different kinds of ways. Um, when we talk about even in a career, say what value is learning to read literature when I'm going to be, I just want to be a manager of a store, or I want to go into business, or I want to go into architecture. But learning how to deal with situations, learning how to interpret and evaluate situations, learning how to understand where other people are coming from, people who are not you, people who are from different backgrounds or different, um, different lives. Learning how to understand more is a skill that will come in handy no matter what you're doing, where you are, and however long you live. Okay. So this is why I'm so passionate about teaching literature, because I think it just is a foundation for understanding other humans. And I think that that is the central point of our existence. All right. So what are the tenets of liberal humanism? So there you can see there are 10 tenets here, on this page. Timelessness, it's not for an age, but for all time. That's one of the tenets of liberal humanism. As a work should be for all time, not for an age. There are some works that are very specific to an era, and once the era is over, it 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 ceases to maintain relevance and it falls out of fashion, and then it falls away from reading lists. There are things on reading lists that are very contemporary that we're reading, that we read and interpret, that may not be on listed as something important on a reading list in 30 years. Okay, so think of songs. Songs do that. I mean, songs are hot, they're popular, they're number one, and they maintain that for a little bit. And then, years later, you look back. I mean, look at this huge catalog of music from the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and only a handful of them stay. All right. And so, tenets of liberal humanism: timelessness. Literary text contains its own meaning. It's not socio-political, not historical, not biographical. The text is by itself, away from the author, away from the context, away from the historical, away from the sociological elements. The close verbal analysis of the text without any assumption prior to coming to it. And so human nature, it assumes that human nature is unchanging. And again, this is a controversial element of liberal humanism. Is human nature really unchanging? I don't know. Individuality is relatively fixed and unique to the essence of the individual. That is, the individual transcends the forces of society, experience, and language. Someone who is from a French-speaking nation who speaks only French, someone who's from a Spanish-speaking nation who speaks only Spanish, and someone from an English-speaking nation who speaks only English. These individuals will share universal traits, according to a liberal humanist. Okay. The purpose of literature is to enhance life and propagate human values, but without propaganda. 7, form and content fuse in organic ways. All the forms should integrate into the meaning. There's a sincerity and an honesty and a compassion component. The expression of feeling should be understated. Show, don't tell. Concrete, that's number 9. Show, don't tell. Concrete embodiment and enactment over ideas. So the liberal humanist looks for those concrete, specific details in a work that create meaning. Again, kind of away from and separate from ideas of like society and language, specificity, but what are the ways that language is used to create concrete and specific elements through which we can interpret ideas. So the critic's job, and we're going to use the term critic and criticism in ways that might be a little different, but the critic's job is to mediate between the text and the reader. You are bearing meaning from the text and imparting that or sharing that with the reader. So that's what they see as a critic's job. Okay. Um, Real quick, I mean, I really don't want to get bogged down in some of this stuff, but it's in the chapter, so I wanted to touch on it. That is that brief history of criticism begins with Aristotle. So I think that's an important name to know. Aristotle. Aristotle believed that tragedy should simulate pity and fear, or sympathy and empathy, and that the reader gets to play out their own sympathy and their empathy on the characters, and it provides a catharsis. It allows you to explore your own anxiety without having to expose your own anxiety to the world, but you can work it out vicariously through characters and through these plots. So Aristotle believed that um, that that pity and fear, that sympathy and empathy, humans practice that's a necessary thing for people to be well-rounded and well-adjusted people, is to play out sympathy and empathy in stories, in literature, in Greek plays. All right. And then 1580, we Philip Sidney writes about how poetry should teach by delighting. A poem is a speaking picture. This was revolutionary, right? And so the idea of teaching, the idea that a work of art, a literature, poem, story should teach, or didactic, that's what didactic means. That the didactic or the teaching element is separate from the literary merit of a work. Okay. Um, so just going to run through this stuff. Samuel Johnson um, details a commentary of the work of a single author. And so that in the 18th century, that's the 1700s, we get the first study of an individual author. All right. And we're getting into a place where people are more literate now. So in Aristotle's age, fewer than 1% of the population could read and write. Much fewer than 1%. It's in the 1700s, you're approaching probably 30%. Don't quote me, but say around 30. But Samuel Johnson explored the work of William Shakespeare, which was significant in that this was the first time that we applied literary reading to something other than biblical works and divinely inspired writing. So we have a work that's not created as a biblical interpretation, but we are looking at the work of mortal authors, in particular the works of Shakespeare, the poems and the plays. All right. Then the Romantics, Wordsworth, Keats, and Shelley. And so we start to get into this discussion of high literature and popular literature. You might have this discussion about bands. If you really like a band and you feel like it's kind of your niche, it's your thing, it's your discovery, and you don't feel other people would understand the music in the way that you do, and then all of a sudden that band gets really popular, and then we start to say, well, is the initial or original album the best, and then the rest of them are just to appease the the masses, the population, right? So it's an argument that we have, and then there's no right answer to it. It does it. We have this notion of whether or not people who haven't been taught how to appreciate all the different elements of poetics and all the different nuances and all the different ways that a poem has meaning, how can they truly appreciate it? So if everyone likes this poem, can the poem be of high literary quality, or by the very fact that it's so popular, is it not? And that's an argument. Um, so romantics lead to a defamiliarization. That is, they want us to see things that we think we know, but feel unfamiliar about them. All right. So to feel that which we perceive and imagine that which we know. All right. T.S. Eliot then in the 1920s, 1919 technically, but reading through 1920s, puts forth a distinction of the author and the writer. And he wants to separate the two as a mark of literary talent, right? So the author is an individual who writes the story. The writer is someone who's doing the writing of the story. But how do we distinguish these two, different sort of minds of the same individual? The Victorians have two tracks. There's a practical and an idealistic track. And so we talk about close reading, which again is where we're beginning. And this is Matthew Arnold, T.S. Eliot, Larry Levis. Arnold believes in the decline in religion would leave society with no common system of belief, so literature might supplant that. So again, this was sort of related to a culture of the time and how critics saw the work of literature and the role of literature. And then there is the ideas side of the track. And this is tackling big general issues like structure, the nature of language, the relationship to contemporary matters of politics and gender. So this is Sidney, William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. This has more in common with contemporary theories and has been developing alongside of a practical approach from the beginning. So these are not separate, completely separate ideas. They are separate, but they're very closely related and they follow one another. All right. So, again, there's which view should we take? Literature is disinterested knowledge, or literature is direct cause and effect of cultural and political conversations and understanding? Should we challenge the view of the pantheon of great writers or accept them as geniuses in the halls of great literature? Should we continue to challenge and say, why is Shakespeare considered a genius? Why is John Donne considered a great poet, for instance? Why is William Wordsworth considered a great poet? Or should we just accept that people knew what they were talking about, and so we just accept that that's the truth? All right. So, how might language explode into meanings we hadn't suspected of being there? We learn every day. So, ask yourself, how might language be used in new ways, in ways that we don't expect, in ways that we didn't know yesterday or last week or last year? Life is a continuous process of learning. I hope to know more next year. I hope to look back on this year and say, boy, I thought I knew it, but I didn't. All right. That's me. I'm continuing to learn all through my life. All right. So this is a concept called indeterminacy. All right. So 1930s to the 1970s is guided by practical criticism in Britain or new criticism in America. All right. And we're going to talk more about these things. So theory's response is to not accept liberal humanism as a natural way of doing things. So of all the things that we've been talking about, liberal humanism wants to look and determine like universal truths and that it's a natural way of interpreting and determining meaning. But practical criticism alone is not enough. So Levis needs to spell out the assumptions in which practical criticism is based. All right. So liberal humanism in practice is like, for one, approach the approach that's driven by moral convictions rather than a systematic approach. So the liberal humanist looking at Poe's The Oval Portrait from the appendix in our book might focus on the conflict of values between art and life. And again, so you would have to determine what the value of art, the value of life, and how these intersect and how these work against one another, etc. The interpretation might be the moralist argument that the true value lies in the lived life of the unique individual. But is that right? I don't know. So, see, somebody else could have a different interpretation of moral value, and then they have a different reading of it. So, again, these are all conversations. Okay. Liberal humanist bypasses the matters of form and structure and goes to content. So discussions of structure and symbolism and design, these are secondary to the primary focus of moralizing the story. But you can see how we will look at different ways of interpreting the story based on what we find in the structure. What did Poe, the author, put in place in the structure that are cues to how we might interpret meaning from the oval portrait. Okay. So I don't want to just read all these points off. You can see the turn to theory, but theory responds in ways that roughly equivocate to the decades that follow and strike against moralist universalism in the liberal humanist. So it says instead of moralizing or judgment or evaluative, how is it that we can provide some objective measure of meaning? All right. So Marxist and psychoanalytic criticism emerge as early reactions to liberal humanism. And these will give way to linguistic criticism and feminist criticism. In the 70s, structuralism and post-structuralism emerge out of French theorists. And so the French theorists are very strong in determining the path of critical theories and interpretation throughout the 70s. And then in the 80s is a shift to new historicism and cultural materialism. So this is taking a more holistic approach, a large scale approach, integrating literary historical observations, maintaining structuralist and post-structuralist ideas. And so it's incorporating, it's learning, it's saying, okay, psychoanalytic was good. And then we got into the French theorists of structuralism. But then new historicism in the 80s adds to that. They don't forget the previous theories. In the 90s, we get toward more of the special interest varieties where post-colonialism, we start to get rejection of earlier ones. So post-colonialism rejects Marxism. Does that mean Marxist criticism as a philosophical way of reading details of a work to create meaning? Does that mean that it's wrong suddenly? No. And so we focus really, but what happens is the focus is shifting. We've learned something or we've learned to interpret something differently. And so the focus then becomes on like post-imperial nations and people as we start to explore what that means and the role in history. And then we end up with some theories like feminism, which progresses into gender studies, which encompasses the tenets of queer theory and other theoretical discourses. All right. So some recurrent ideas, and note this is a very simplified version. Recurrent ideas of social construction. Many notions that we think of as givens are fluid and unstable. So fixed truths are not really truths, they're assumptions. And so theorists attack this essentialist notion that, oh, this is always true. All right. And we'll get to some examples of that as we read. But relativism, which is that individuals are already committed to a prior ideology. And so we have to get away from that so that we can become more objective. So if we learn to bypass our existing ideology, note that there may be another way to look at this. There may be other ways that these words have meaning. There may be other contexts that will allow us then to create a much more objective look at the work. Constructs of language. So we're going to do a lot with the structure of language, which I think is a fascinating part. It's one of my favorite chapters when we get to that point. And there are no fixed and definitive meanings, but meaning is always shifting based on the receiver of the message, based on what the context the receiver of the message is bringing. I bring my own background and my own history to a reading, and I interpret a work based on that. And your background might be different from mine. And so you interpret it a little bit differently. It meets your experience in a different way. All right. That is at the center of all these totalizing notions that there's a universal human nature. We'll explore the ways that is really kind of an erroneous assumption in most cases. Okay. So the summary of these 5 points. 1, politics is pervasive. 2, language is constitutive. what does that mean? Well, that means that works arise out of situations in which there is leadership and influence, and works react within and against that. Two, language is constitutive, meaning language is constructed out of our meaning. Language also influences how we interpret things, and language becomes recirculative. And so, we start to look at connotations and denotations, and the meanings of words changes. Okay, we have to be able to roll with that. Truth is provisional. The idea of truth is one person's idea, but is not a universal and ultimate uh, rule. So one person's truth may not be another person's truth, and so this is where the play of uh, critical interpretation allows us to explore the ways that an individual work has meaning. Meaning is contingent. That is, that meaning depends upon culture, context, focus, what you're looking at, what you're looking for, and how you interpret that. Meaning is contingent. And finally, 5, human nature is a myth. That is, there is not one single human nature, but rather humans are created within cultures. Their different cultures value different things, present things differently, interpret things differently. Okay, so that's just a little wind up to what you read. Again, these main points, you got them in the chapter that you read. I thought it maybe help if I kind of talk you through it a little bit, provide some more surrounding context for that stuff. So anyway, if you have questions, send me an email. I'm looking forward to reading to finishing the questions from last week, and to see what kinds of discussions we get into this week. All right, so again, stick with it. We're going to start soon applying these theoretical principles to, we're going to open with Dante's Inferno. So again, we're going to take these one segment at a time. We read the first 5 cantos of Dante's Inferno. We apply a theoretical perspective to that. Then another 5 cantos of the Inferno and a different theoretical perspective. And we're going to see how we can take the same text and read it in different ways, um, and explore how it has meaning in multiple ways based on what lenses we're wearing, what lenses are we looking through to see, what are we focusing on in terms of meaning. All right. So again, email with any questions, and hope you're having a good week.